1st and March 2nd. If anyone has read those and feels it's appropriate for a motion to approve, I'd receive that. Motion to approve by Representative Blex, second by Representative Howerton. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. We're going to have an informational briefing this morning, and we'll start with Chief Engineer Earl Lewis.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good to be back before you again today. We'll talk about Quivira National Wildlife Refuge and their water right in Rattlesnake Creek for a little bit. I know you're going to hear from some other folks as well. I think I've got a PowerPoint here. We're going to cover a lot of ground here. It's got a long history, but it's gotten to be more urgent here recently, and we'll cover the why here. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And just to give you kind of a summary of what the issue here is here, U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a 1957 surface water right out of the Rattlesnake Creek to serve the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. So that's a fairly senior water right. Stream flow in the Rattlesnake Creek that serves that water right is being depleted by upstream junior groundwater pumping, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. In 2016, that right was determined by the previous chief engineer to be impaired. And again, that's something that's covered under the Water Appropriation Act. And then what's brought that back again, so that we're talking about it here today in 2023 is in February 10th of this year, U.S. Fish and Wildlife filed a request to secure water in their senior water right. And that's somewhat of a term of art that really means they want to have their water right protected. This is just somewhat of a location map to kind of make sure that we're all oriented to the same spot in the state. You can kind of see in the location map there at the one. Let's go back one. That's all right. You can kind of see the gray area there in the very south central portion of the state. This is the surface area for the Rattlesnake Creek. You can see on the upper right there, kind of that gray area is Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. And then each of those red dots is essentially a well, primarily for irrigation, but not completely for irrigation. So again, that's just to kind of give you a little bit of reference of what we're talking about today. Let's go to the next one. And again, to give you a little bit more background before we dive into some of the history here, the National Wildlife Refuge, again, priority date of August 15th, 1957. The certificate was issued, so it was finally settled on how much their water right actually covered in 1996. Is an authorized quantity of 14,632 acre feet, can divert up to 300 cubic feet per second. Recreation, again, most of our recreation in the state of Kansas, at least from use made of water, is for wetlands, this type of activity. And the National Wildlife Refuge there covers a little over 22,000 acres. So again, that just a little bit of background to kind of cover where we're at. So where do we come into this? Where does the law come into this? Again, we're talking about water rights. We're talking about the Kansas Water Appropriation Act. It goes clear back to 1945. Surface and groundwater are both covered under the same act in the state of Kansas. They're covered under the same system. Not every state in the West covers both surface and groundwater under the same right. Kansas has been since 1945. So that's really what puts us in this situation here today. 828707 really lays that out. Surface and groundwaters of the state may be appropriate, so it really puts them both together at the same place. Goes on to say that the priority of that use is what governs who gets water in times of shortage. Again, and you can see between persons with appropriation rights, the first in time, the first in rights. So that's why in this case, that 1957 date is really important. Let's go on to the next one. So where do we come in? What's the role of the chief engineer when we get into a situation where we've got conflicting water rights, where we don't have enough water to go around? And 706B, also in the Appropriation Act, again, is very clear. It is unlawful for any person with a junior right to prevent water from moving to somebody that has a senior right. Again, this is the very basis. If you don't have enough water to go around, if somebody with a junior right is stopping water from moving to somebody with a senior right, it goes on to say the chief engineer shall, as may be necessary, secure water for the person having that priority right. And so that's, again, when we talk about that securing water, that's really where that term of art comes from. Again, point out in this case that The statute is clear. This is not a discretionary duty. It doesn't say the chief engineer can, it doesn't say the chief engineer may. It says the chief engineer shall, right? It says we shall take action. And so that's very clear. It doesn't say on what time frame, it doesn't say on how we do that, but it does say we need to take action to make sure that we are protecting that senior right. And again, I think if you think about this from the broader context, what we're talking about is property rights. And one of the key roles of the state and the key roles of this position in the Appropriation Act is when there's property rights and there's not enough water to go around, it's managing those different property rights. And again, that priority system to determine who gets water in which order based on that property rights. 706B goes on to talk about directing head gates, valves, wells, those kind of things to change. And then one thing is unique in this situation was added in 2015 is that second part there within the Rattlesnake Creek subbasin, allow augmentation for the replacement in time, location, and quantity for the unlawful diversion if such replacement is available and offered voluntarily. So what that means is we've got a host of things we can do to try and resolve the impairment. This is the only place in the state that we can allow augmentation, so we can allow water to be pumped out of the ground and put into the stream to resolve the impairment or resolve a portion of the impairment. And there's certainly an effort underway to do that. And so we certainly support that effort, and we certainly, even if we didn't support it, statutorily we would have to anyway, but we do support it in general. So why when we talk about groundwater impacting surface water, what does that mean? So if we think about an undeveloped situation, if we, before we had all the wells in there, we had the aquifer was higher, the water level in the aquifer was higher than the stream. We still have that in many cases in the state of Kansas. Water would flow naturally, it flows downhill, underground as well. Flow downhill to the stream, discharge, that's where we see springs and seeps and that sort of thing. And we would have groundwater that supports stream flow. That's really what you see in kind of the upper portion. We put in wells, we create a cone of depression, we start pulling water that normally would go from the groundwater to the surface water, and ultimately, if we pump enough, we start reversing the flow and we get water that comes out of the stream and goes into the ground rather than the other way around. That's kind of the situation we have here. And so that's where we get into the situation of surface water and groundwater being managed or regulated together. And again, I think the wisdom was put in place in 1945 to put both groundwater and surface water rights under the same system because we can manage these things cooperatively or conjunctively. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to go through a couple of slides here. And so this is a little bit more of a close-up. You can still see the Quivira National Wildlife in the upper right portion. The shading that you see is based on what we call a response map. So this is the Groundwater Management District number 5 went out and hired professional modelers to model the groundwater situation, the groundwater surface water interaction. It is the same model that we use. We believe it's a good model, that it accurately represents the situation and will give us a good indication of what changes may happen that would impact or not impact the stream flow. As you might expect, the closer you are to the stream, the more impact a groundwater pumper has on the stream. And so the more red you get, that means more pumping, more impact on the stream. As we go further out, we get less and less pumping impacting on the stream. And so over time, there's been these different zones that's been developed, I think generally are fairly well accepted. And so everything within the red area we call Zone A. And you can see on the map shows the number of wells, the number of points of diversion that existed in 1957 at the time that Quivira first applied for their water right. At that time, there were 60 water rights within Zone A. We're going to run that through, and then you'll see here in 2016, there are 1,436 water rights. So you can see, as this on the right side kind of loops through, each of those lighter blue and bigger dots are a new well that comes in that year, that gets permitted in that year. And you can see during the 70s, we see a significant growth in the number of points of diversion in that basin. And I'll just let that run through. You can kind of see by the early 90s, the development was fairly well complete, here and there a little bit. But for that most part, really most of the development happened in the 70s in this basin. And so again, think about it from the standpoint of 1957, there were 60, so there are 60 water rights or wells in that basin that are senior to Quivira National Wildlife Water Right. There are 1,430 wells total in that area. So you can do the math, there's not quite 1,400 junior wells within Zone A. Let's go to the next one. Again, that just locks it in, so you can see kind of the difference of where we're at in 2016 versus 1957. And so we picked 2016 just for this animation, simply because that is the date that there was determination that impairment was occurring. Let's go ahead and, again, a location map just to get you oriented to the next couple of slides. There are two USGS gauging stations on the Rattlesnake Creek. One of them at Maxville, that's the lower one, and one at Zenith, which is just right upstream from the boundary of Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. And again, you can kind of put that in perspective with the maps you just saw. So let's go to the next one. So this is a map. So the Maxville gauge has been around since about 1960. And so this graphic will show on 10-year averages over time, what's the stream flow response or how much stream flow we had at Maxville. And so you can kind of see over time, as it's going through to current time period, how much stream flow, how much less stream flow we have today versus what we had in 1960. Can you go back and go back one and let that loop again? So you can kind of see over time, as that development happened, we also see the response in the stream flow, right? We see development of groundwater. Again, this is not unexpected. We see a lowering of the amount of stream flow we see on a consistent basis. And so the way you work this graph is, this is a flow frequency or flow exceedance graph. And so if we look and say, let's look at, say, 80% of the time. In 1960s, 80% of the time, we had 10 CFS of flow at Maxville. And we kind of see it moving down, and we get to 2000s, and we don't have any, 80% of the time, it's zero. Okay. Let's go on to the next one, which is Zenith, same kind of a thing. It came in the early 70s, and so you can kind of see how it responds. We obviously, it's further downstream. We have more support from groundwater. We have higher flow, but again, you can kind of see over time as we move through, we get to where it's at today. And again, if we look at 80%, that's not necessarily a magic number, but in the early days, we would have had 20 or 30 CFS 80% of the time. Now we're down below 10 CFS. So we've seen a marked decline in the amount of stream flow in the Rattlesnake Creek that, again, feeds the senior surface water right. And again, that kind of matches up with what we've seen with the groundwater development pumping. Those things aren't necessarily bad. Not to say that anybody's done anything wrong. Nobody went out and did anything illegal and made bad decisions. This is kind of how things developed, just the way that over time we have collectively made decisions, but we've all been in this situation together. So let's go on to the next one. Again, to kind of give you a little bit of a history, again, 1957, August 57 is when the Fish and Wildlife applied for the water right. They asked for 22,000 acre feet at that time. And they began based on the graphs we just started seeing, the last two. We're seeing stream flow being depleted during that time, and in the 80s, U.S. Fish and Wildlife began to express concerns about the ability to use their senior surface water right for its intended purpose. So much so that in the early 90s, in 1994, there was a partnership formed between Fish and Wildlife, between DWR, Local Groundwater Management District, and Water Protection Association of Central Kansas, or WaterPAC. And I know Pat Jansen is going to be here and talking just a little bit about WaterPAC. Formed in 1994 to try and address the overall depletion and the issues that are coming up. 1996 was when the water right was finally certified, and that becomes, in Kansas, it might take a step back. In Kansas, the process really is, if you want to develop a water right, you apply for a permit to do so. And so the state then issues you a permit, you go out and put water to beneficial use, the state determines how much water was used during what's called the perfection period, typically about a 5 or 10 year period. And then that becomes what your property right is. So you develop a property right through use. You don't get a property right given to you by the state. You're given a permit to develop a property right. And so the certificate of the water right is really that final document that says, during your perfection period, here's how much water you were able to put to beneficial use. Here's how big your project needs to be. Let's go back just one more, just for a second here, if I can. One of the key things that has come up a number of times is some question about whether or not that number is right, whether the 14,632 number is right. And certainly there's some other folks in the room that have a lot more history with that, but I can tell you there was a lot of back and forth during that time. And in fact, again, if you think about the standpoint of where we start with the second bullet, recognizing that the state and federal government both saw that there were depletions happening in the 1980s. The year of record, the year that we based that water out on, was 1987. And so the service agreed at that time, kind of as part of a negotiation with the state of Kansas, that they would agree that there were 8,000 on average acre feet of depletions at that time. So there's one side that'll say it's too high because they never use that much water. There's another side that'll say that they didn't use that much water because there wasn't water in the stream that was already being depleted. The other side of that, folks will say we ought to reopen that. We're not going to reopen that, right? That number is there. And not only because of the conflicting arguments of whether or not that's the right number, but there are 34,500 water rights in the state of Kansas. And if we open one back up and say we're going to renegotiate the number, we'll have 34,000 people that'll come right behind and want theirs done as well. There are set timeframes established for when you can do that. We are well past that timeframe. That's the number we're using. Let's go on to the next one. So again, we had a partnership in place in 1994. In 2000, the partnership finalized a 12-year management plan with a goal of 27,346 acre feet of reductions or savings in that area. In 2012, the evaluation showed there was about 2,800 acre feet of savings. So we didn't actually meet the goal. In 2013, U.S. Fish and Wildlife asked the chief engineer to investigate whether their senior surface water right was actually being impaired. So that started kind of the legal process here. In the middle of this, in 2015, again, the legislature modified 706B, allowed augmentation in the Rattlesnake Creek. So we've had that option since 2015. And on July 15, 2016, chief engineer finalized a report saying, yes, the senior surface water right is being impaired. So let's go to the next one. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean you get all the water you want all the time. And how we look at that, and again, I won't necessarily go through this because this can be somewhat maybe a little wonky and a little complicated, but if we look at that zenith gauge flow and say, how much does the refuge need at that given time? Is there enough water in the stream to meet their needs? If there is, there's no impairment, right? If there's not, then we look and say, how much water would have been there if not for the junior pumping? If those junior users were not actually using water, how much water would have been there? And if there's more water that would have been there than actually showed up at the gauge, then the difference would be their need minus how much water was there. That'll be how much they are impaired. Okay, so we're trying to look at how much water is not getting to the stream because of junior groundwater pumping, and then how much does the service need, right? There's a lot of times that the stream flow is in excess of what the service needs. There's other times where it's not. But we're only looking at the times where the service needs water to operate their refuge, and there's not water physically available at their point of diversion. And part of that reason that there's not water there is because of junior water right holders' impacts on that stream flow. Okay, so it's kind of a three-part question there. That's how we get to say, is there an impairment or not? Okay, let's go to the next one. And again, this is, you can study this all you want afterwards, but what it shows is the light blue is the flow at the zenith gauge over time. You can kind of see the darker green line, the light green at the beginning. That's what service needs based on their current management program. The darker blue is what the model tells us would have been at the zenith gauge if we only had essentially those 60 water rights that were in place in 1957. So the effects of the junior pumping on the stream flow is what we see in that dark blue area. And so then you can kind of see the red area is the area where the service in their current operation, when they need water, and then where it's short, primarily due to the effects of pumping upstream. Okay, so that's really where we focus on. You can see that there's a lot of times where the effects are much greater. The model would tell us that the amount of water that is being depleted out of the stream because of upstream pumping can vary from 30 to 60,000 acre feet in a given year. Again, that's not necessarily wrong or bad. That's the overall impact. And again, we aren't looking at, do we need to get back to having all that water in the stream? We don't need all that water in the stream to serve the senior rights. We're trying to make sure that we meet their needs, but not really overshoot. We don't want to implement activities that go beyond our needs, is maybe the right way to say it. Again, that's a pretty complicated graph. I know. Let's go to the next one. If we summarize it down, what is the amount of water that, as of the report in 2016, showed we were short? You'll see the time period goes, in this case, from the 70s up through 2007. And again, the time period was set based on the amount of data that was available in the model at the time that we were running that evaluation. The data went up through 2007. So you can see it varies. It's not every single year. It's most years. It can vary from just a few acre feet up to 1991, 8,580 acre feet of water would have been available for Crevere's senior need based on their pattern of need. And again, I keep going back to that because it's important, right? They need water during certain periods of time in order to serve the purposes for which the refuge was put in place. They don't necessarily need water in December. They don't necessarily need water in July, right? They need water in the spring. They need water in the fall because that's when we see the purpose of the refuge of being served. We think about it, if it was for agricultural use, having water in December doesn't help somebody that's going to grow corn. Having water in May or April doesn't help. Having water in August is critical. So it's the same kind of evaluation. When does that water right purpose need water to be served? And so that's, excuse me, that's really what this graphic shows is that split between how much water is there, how much water they need during that time. Okay? So again, that gives you kind of a scope of where we're at. Let's go to the next one. So to bring it to where we are today, the next couple slides. So in 2017, after it was a determination in 2016 that there was an impairment going on, U.S. Fish and Wildlife filed this request to secure water. Division of Water Resources began working with GMD5 in late 2017 on development of a local enhanced management area, or LEMA. Those things continue for 2 years. In 2018, U.S. Fish and Wildlife again filed a request to secure water. In 2019, the LEMA plan was submitted to the chief engineer, and that same year, chief engineer determined that LEMA plan was not significant, did not meet statutory requirements, nor did it solve the impairment. And so denied moving forward with the LEMA for those two purposes, because it didn't meet statutory requirements, nor did it solve the impairment. In 2020, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and GMD signed a memorandum of agreement that U.S. Fish and Wildlife would not file requests to secure water in 2020 or 2021, and the GMD would pursue an augmentation and provide a 12-month plan on how to get that augmentation done, as well as other actions. In January of 2021, Audubon, Kansas filed suit excuse me, against U.S. Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, those primarily because they believed that U.S. Fish and Wildlife should not have entered into the MOA. They were giving, I'm paraphrasing, you can read all the documents online if you want to, but primarily because they believed that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife should not have entered into the MOA, that they were giving away some of the federal rights that they didn't have the ability to do so under federal law. They filed suit against Chief Engineer and Secretary of Agriculture, primarily for, in their words, us not taking action on the request to secure water in 17 and 18. That was filed in federal court. It was dismissed against all parties. For the federal parties, it was dismissed primarily because the court determined that there was not a final federal action that the Audubon could take action on, have standing on. In the state side, our argument was this is federal court. We're talking about our role is implementing state law. And so, first of all, the venue is wrong, right? We don't want federal courts or the federal government telling us how to operate federal or state water rights within Kansas borders. This is kind of a very bright white line that we want to make sure and keep the federal government on one side of. We're on the other side. We're going to maintain state primacy over water rights and water administration. So Audubon has appealed the federal side. It's now in appeals court. They're dealing with that. They have not appealed the portion on the state side. So we're out of that lawsuit for the time being. We're out of that lawsuit. In 2021, GMD5 received a grant from NRCS to pursue looking at feasibility of augmentation project. We're still in the middle of that. And again, I think maybe some other folks can talk about it, but we're hoping that level, that feasibility level, can be determined this year, and then go back, GMD5 can go back and secure additional funds to actually implement a project. That's one of the things that we are certainly supportive of. And again, where we're talking here today is just right at a month ago, U.S. Fish and Wildlife filed a request to secure water. So a couple things. First and foremost, so the request to secure water was sent, the letter was sent February 10th. The actual, we've got a form folks have to fill out. That form was signed on February 6th. The form asked that we begin administration on February 7th. Well, first, we got it on the 10th, so we couldn't start on the 7th. But we've also said the timing of this is problematic because of the situation we're in, right? So as you can tell, it's a very complex situation. There are any number of junior water rights that are impacted, and certainly this time of year is very difficult when we're talking about agricultural use. So we've had conversations with both U.S. Fish and Wildlife the following week, and also at the GMD5 annual meeting, we told them both the same things. We said, we are not going to do strict administration. We are not going to do water right administration in 2023. We know if we do that, we're just going to end up spending all of our time in court for the entire year. It's going to create havoc in the basin and create more chaos than we already have. But we said we've got to take this seriously. Not that folks aren't taking it seriously, but this is the role, as you saw in 706B, this is a role for the chief engineer. And so we're going to take this seriously. We want to work with the parties, but develop a plan that hopefully we can resolve this issue for the long term, hopefully with implementation beginning in 2024 and beyond. So that's kind of where we sit. At some point, go back to the feasibility just real quick. Again, that's underway. We encourage that to move along as expeditiously as possible. I know you're going to hear from Heidi Mell and Pat Jansen here just shortly about some other voluntary efforts. We support every single one of those. We want as much voluntary work as we can get, right? We want to be as cooperative as we can, but we have a statutory obligation we've got to meet. And again, just to speak frankly here, I go back to that graphic that shows the extent of the impairment up to 8,000 acre-feet of water. That's a significant number to get restored. I have my doubts of whether or not the augmentation project by itself is going to solve that problem. I certainly hope so, because I'd rather do that than anything else. And we support whatever level of augmentation we can get. I want to balance that because at some point, assuming that book goes forward, we're going to have to permit that as well, right? That'll be a permitted water right as well. And so as we look at that, we'll have to look at what are going to be the impacts of taking that water out of the ground from wherever it's going to come from to put it in the stream, right? And we know kind of where they're thinking about. We know there's domestic rights there. We know there may be impacts on other streams. And so we're going to have to balance that as well. Again, I want to just be upfront and honest here. We support that. We encourage it. But it's not an open-ended checkbook here. We've got to make sure that as we implement that, we're not causing harm to somebody else at the same time we're trying to solve one problem. I don't know where that balance lies today, but again, I just want to be upfront that there is a balance there we're going to have to look at. It's not an open-ended checkbook here. So that's where we stand today, and we certainly want to work with everybody to try and get a plan in place that resolves it once and for all, not only because we have a request to secure water, but also because, as you've seen, this has got a very long history going back 30 years. In some ways, for the last 15 or 20, this has been hanging over folks' head in the area, wondering, when the shoe's going to drop. And so we want to get a plan in place. Everybody knows what the certainty is. We want to make sure we do that in time for folks to be able to react, but make sure that it's a durable, long-term plan, that we don't have to keep coming back every single year and have a discussion about whether we got it right or not. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be happy to try and answer questions if anybody has any.
Thank you. That was an amazing half an hour detail. I think we'll move along at this time and ask for Heidi Mell and Nature Conservancy to come forward. If you have a question, please write it down, and at the end here, we'll allow the committee an opportunity to ask questions of all the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. And I am here with my colleague Pat Jansen from WaterPack, and we would like to highlight for you some of our partnerships and voluntary opportunities that we've brought into the Rattlesnake Creek Basin. So we do have a PowerPoint. Yeah. Should be pulled up short. Thank you. So just a quick couple slides to give you an overview of the Nature Conservancy in case you're not familiar with our organization. Our vision is a world where people and nature thrive, and we want to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And when we say all life in our vision, we mean both nature and people. So we recognize we're a pragmatic organization. We recognize that any solutions that support nature also have to support human economies and communities, or else it will be undone at some point in the future. So we look for those pragmatic middle-of-the-road opportunities. Some statistics over there on the right about our organization. We do work in 72 countries and all 50 states in the United States. We employ over 400 scientists. We're a science-based organization, and we are primarily funded by our dedicated members, of which we have over 1 million. You can go to the next slide. What's that? Okay. So our global priorities are in these four broad categories. One is to protect land and water. 2 is to tackle climate change. 3, provide food and water sustainably. And 4, build healthy cities. And our work in the Rattlesnake Creek Basin primarily falls under provide food and water sustainably. So if you go to the next slide, we have some statistics about the situation with food provisioning that we are facing. A predicted 73% increase in food protein demand by 2050. 70% of freshwater use is already devoted to food systems. So basically, we have to figure out how to meet our demand for increased food provisioning without increasing our footprint in terms of water, in terms of carbon. How can we increase the efficiency of our food systems so that we can scale up that food demand while not further affecting our freshwater systems and our natural systems? 52% of world agricultural land is significantly degraded, and I will point out that is a global statistics. That's not the United States. That is globally. And 25% of greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems. So one thing that I see in those statistics is a whole lot of opportunity. We are, in the United States, we are ahead of the game in many ways. We have the opportunity, we have the resources available to find solutions to these global problems and demonstrate to the rest of the world the best way that these things can be done. So that's something that we're trying to do at the Nature Conservancy. So our priorities are listed here on this slide. We want to test scalable solutions and scale up practice adoption and systems level change. And that includes things like water efficient strategies and water efficient technologies. 4R plus nutrient stewardship, which if you're not familiar, it's the 4 R's are right time, right place, right rate, and right type of fertilizer. So it's a way of applying fertilizer that reduces runoff as much as possible into our freshwater systems. We want to demonstrate and scale up soil health practices, the 5 principles of soil health, And on the grazing side, we work on prescribed grazing, range condition improvement, and control of woody invasives, especially in places like the Flint Hills and the Red Hills. So we can go to the next slide. So that overview brings me to our partnership with WaterPack. And one of the first projects that I'll highlight for you is our Conservation Innovation Grant. We partnered with the organizations that are listed across the top there, WaterPack, Big Bend Groundwater Management District number 5, Kansas State Research and Extension, and the NRCS. And we applied for these funds in 2019. They were awarded in 2020. And the funding can, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the funding is targeted in the Rattlesnake Creek Basin, which is in the middle of the screen there in purple. And I'm sure you saw that watershed quite a bit in Mr. Lewis's presentation. So it flows across the middle of Groundwater Management District number 5 and terminates in Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. Go to the next slide. And this slide shows the percent change in aquifer thickness. So this is just to highlight one of the reasons why we are working on these particular strategies in this basin. So, you know, we pay a lot of attention to the condition of the High Plains aquifer and the reductions of water that we're seeing across the aquifer. And what this map shows is that, you know, not all formations of that aquifer are created equal. So we have much greater depletions in the southwest and sort of middle west part of the state. But in the Great Bend Sand Prairie aquifer, the depth to water is much more shallow. There's greater infiltration because of the sand. And so there's a greater recharge rate in that area. So we have seen less of a decrease in aquifer thickness in that area, but as Mr. Lewis pointed out, the impairment is seasonal. So it's a matter of the irrigators needing the water at the same time that the refuge needs it. So that aquifer table can drop, and then it can rebound when the irrigation season is over. So we formed this partnership and applied for the Conservation Innovation Grant, and our objectives under that grant are to increase adoption of more efficient irrigation packages, such as soil moisture sensors and irrigation scheduling tools. Number 2, monitor improvements in irrigation efficiency and yield per unit of water. And 3, set up those peer-to-peer mentoring networks so that folks who are participating can export their learning, export their experiences, and talk to their peers about how things have gone for them participating in the grant. We did end up with 23 entities participating on 38 fields across the basin, so we had really great interest, and we were able to obligate all of our cost share funding under the grant. Unfortunately, I don't have data points from the grant to present to you today because we've only collected data for 2 seasons, and one of those seasons was the drought last year, so that's a major outlier. So we are working on the statistical data. We have 1 more year of data collection, and I would be thrilled to come back after we process the data and present our findings to you. But we are intending to apply for another round of funding, so hopefully we can continue this project. So although I don't have any data points to present today, we do have some lessons learned. Number 1, a pumping plant analysis is the first step to improve efficiency. And this takes technical assistance from a certified irrigation engineer. And there are not as many of those folks floating around out there as you might think. And so one of the things that we were able to do under this grant was to allow Lee Wheeler, who is a certified technical service provider and irrigation engineer, to work on those tune-ups of the irrigation system with our participants. And even it's just like tuning up your car, gets you better gas mileage, right? With Mr. Wheeler going out there and working on pumping plant efficiency, doing those initial evaluations and tune-ups, we were able to see some efficiency gains just from those actions. So, sorry, go back 1 slide. So after the pumping plan analysis and that initial tune-up, then it's a good time to look at what equipment needs are needed on the system, whether there is an opportunity for technology like mobile drip lines, or whether efficiencies can be gained just by changing the spacing and the level of the nozzles. And we were able to offer quite a bit of flexibility in this grant. So based on the producer and their operation, their land, their needs, they could choose which technologies they wanted to try out under this grant and receive 50% cost share for any new technology and monitoring components that they installed. And then finally, that last point there, the educational component is extremely important. So there's a need for that peer-to-peer mentoring to understand their neighbors' experiences, to understand what the opportunities are with this technology, but also to build a little bit of trust in it, because, you know, one of the things that we are asking folks to do is to back off of that, you know, irrigating to field capacity, keeping that soil you know, up to field capacity all season long, and maybe back off of that a little bit to allow some room for rain to come into the soil and make better use of the rain. And, you know, that requires a lot of trust in that monitoring technology. It requires a lot of trust that it's going to work. And so those are some cultural changes that take time. So that's something else that we're trying to facilitate through this grant. Okay, so that's our Conservation Innovation Grant. And then the last project I'll just highlight really briefly for you was a partnership between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program, Kansas Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy, and WaterPack. And we were able to bring quite a bit of funding into the basin for removal of invasive trees. We have a big problem with tamarisk, salt cedar, and Russian olive in the basin. And so through that partnership, we were able to work with 16 producers and clear almost 6,500 acres, including over 1,000 wetland acres and 30 stream miles. So there are benefits in that tree removal to stream flow, to groundwater, to water quality, because especially the salt cedar tends to concentrate salts over time in the water. So benefits to water quality, wildlife habitat, but also forage for cattle. You know, cattle don't want to eat salty trees, they want to eat grass. So getting those trees out of there and getting grass in its place was a benefit to producers. So with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Jansen.
My name is Pat Jansen. I serve as president of WaterPack. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you today. My family and I farm south of Kinsley, Kansas. I am not a public speaker, so I want to set your expectations today. Mentally picture yourself getting a book report from a 300-pound fifth grader. The Water Protection Association of Central Kansas was originally started in the early 90s by irrigators that were wanting a unified voice to represent them on policy matters. Over the years, it has evolved. We've gotten into other projects, doing research and education. Next slide, please. WaterPack's mission and objectives. WaterPack is committed to the beneficial, economical, and sustainable use of quality water. We believe in proactive rather than reactive solutions. We assist in funding science-based research and education to aid our members in making the most efficient use of water possible. We continue to develop relationships with government and non-government organizations that foster the achievement of common goals. Our goals are to maintain an open line of communication with all entities involved in water in the state of Kansas. We would really like to be the go-to source for stakeholder input and feedback for policymakers. To always be open, honest, transparent when communicating with partners, members, and regulatory bodies. To work proactively with aligned partners to continue to educate water users on all aspects of water efficiency. To provide counsel and input to government and non-government groups developing cost share and conservation programs to improve outcomes for all parties. That last one is really critical because a lot of the cost share programs that are out there are very burdensome, and the amount of data they require, commitments, et cetera, they're just not a lot of fun. It's kind of like financing a car in Chinese. So if we could do some things to streamline that, that would help us to move the needle to get more things in the country and get them implemented. 7 years ago, our partnerships. 7 years ago, WaterPack started one of the first tech farms in Kansas to study the benefits of mobile drip irrigation. Partnered with the Kansas Water Office, Lee Wheeler, Kansas Corn, K-State, ILS Farms, Teeter Irrigation. 5 years ago, we changed our direction. Mobile drip irrigation is a wonderful product. It has a fit in the marketplace, but our area still has the well capacity and allocations that mobile drip is not going to be widely implemented by any of our producers. So we shifted gears, went back to a standard. What we've got is 2 pivots side by side. This one is our tech farm field. Lee Wheeler, sometimes I get to help him. We do the irrigation scheduling on that one. We've got a conventional sprinkler package. We've done all the work to get everything operating up to standards. The other one, the ILS Farms, does the irrigation scheduling on it. When we started the project, we had a difference of, I believe, 5 inches the first year between the 2 fields with identical yields. So we actually applied 5 inches less to gain the same net bushels. Over the years, the fun part of this deal has been that margin has narrowed. This year we were down to a 1.5 inch spread between the 2. We still beat them, but not by nearly as much as what we have in the past. It's changed their culture and their organization. Blah, blah, blah. Partners are TNC, ILS Farms, K-State, Kansas Corn, Kansas Water Office, and Lee Wheeler Engineering. Next slide. More partnerships. The Rattlesnake Creek Phreatophyte Removal Project. Our role in that was we went to that was the first thing we ever did with Heidi. And you got a room full of farmers, and a nice lady from the Nature Conservancy wants to come and talk to us. This has to be bad. So we get to visiting with Heidi, and our contribution to this project was we went to an oil field lease man, put together a landowner map for all of that creek corridor for her. So when these grant funds came available, there were 3 different entities that wanted some of these grant funds. Heidi got them all because she had a shovel-ready program, landowners already committed, ready to turn the key on the project. Since then, the Nature Conservancy has been one of the best partners we've got, probably anywhere. The Conservation Innovation Grant. This one is going to be really important moving forward. This project has the potential to impact water efficiency not only in the Rattlesnake Basin, but anywhere irrigation is utilized in crop production. The diversity of the soils, crops, water availability is producing a data set that has never been put together before. We're currently in our 3rd year and hope to renew and expand the program for another 3 years. Partners are Nature Conservancy, NRCS, Lee Wheeler Engineering, GMD5, K-State, and a list of innovative producers. The data set that we're putting together on this, when Lee Wheeler and Jonathan Aguilar with K-State printed out, it's about that tall and it's about this wide. We've got water applied, we've got rainfall data, we've got what they refer to as useful rainfall. If you don't maintain a deficit in your irrigation scheduling, if you're at saturation and you get an inch rain, that inch rain was wasted. It pushed right on through the profile and you weren't able to benefit from it. And that's one of the founding principles of this deal, is leaving enough room in your soil profile to be able to take advantage of rainfall when it does occur. And that's where we're gaining the majority of our increases in efficiency after we get the equipment up in shape, is the ability to capture rainfall and utilize it. Next slide. One more partnership, the Acres Initiative. Next slide. Okay, ACRE stands for Augmentation, Conservation, Restoration, Economics, and Sustainability. This nonprofit was formed for the purpose of originating and dispersing funds for resolving the impairment between irrigators and the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. Our goals are to help fund the augmentation project that Earl spoke about, to purchase water rights in that stream corridor that will benefit stream flow from the model. And also, with this particular financial vehicle, we've got the opportunity to make investments on the refuge itself to improve water efficiency, the ability to move water and utilize it. The initial seed funding for this came from local cooperatives, and we are currently in the process of soliciting funds from other nonprofits. Next slide. The water pack geography, you're all familiar with GMD 5. Next slide. Why we're different. This is a soils map showing why we're able to recharge. We're generally pretty sandy, and the aquifer, water levels in our area, I'm going to say, are by and large 50 to 60 feet deep. So when we do get a rainfall event, a large one, it does pass through, and we do see a response in the aquifer. Next slide. Okay, this graph was put together for me by KGS, so it has credibility. I did not make it. The blue bars are the water level change, and I specifically asked Brownie to put this together for 2011, 2012, up through present. Because in 2011, 2012, we had pretty much identical conditions to what we're experiencing right now. And as you can see, we hammered the aquifer, and the average water level in the basin dropped about 4 to 5 feet total. As we move across that graph, you can see the water levels bump up as we got rainfall. Somewhere around 2018, we got back within about a foot of where we started. Of course, then we roll into 2021 and we start the cycle again. And for the most part, that's what it is a cycle. Next slide. And this is the same graph on a different scale. We're varying from, give or take, 27 to 35 feet on the depth of water. What this graph kind of illustrates to me is that we're close to being in balance. The total groundwater decline over this 10-year period was 2.5 feet, which when you compare that to other parts of the state it's still 2.5 foot drop, but it's minuscule compared to what we've seen in other places over the last 10 years. Next slide, please. These numbers were put together by me from various sources, and I am not an economist. The contribution to agriculture, GDP and wages combined, $443,618,000. The gross sales of irrigated crops and live cattle in the 6-county area, $1,578,779,000. Direct contribution to local economy and investment and additional taxes. Irrigated ground pays about $15 an acre more in property taxes than the same acre with no irrigation. That's the $6,212,800. The total is $792,257,000. The net revenue, inputs, sales minus inputs of irrigated crops in our 6-county area is $157,209,000. Brian Brigham at K-State told me I could multiply that times 5 to represent the economic activity that those funds show in the 6-county area. So that brings it up to $786,044,000. If you split that out by the irrigated acres in the district, every acre of irrigated ground in that 6 counties is contributing $1,740 a year to the local economy. Now, I'm not saying we don't need to fix some things, we do, but I just want everybody here to understand the gravity of what this means to these communities from an economic standpoint. Next slide. Okay, you're already there. What makes us so special? We have the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer. This is a shallow aquifer that recharges naturally through the sandy soils that lie above it. We have the science. Through GMD5 and KGS, WaterPack has access to the best water models in the country. This gives us the ability to test the reaction of the aquifer and stream flow to determine the outcome of proposed changes before they are implemented. We're doing the research. Our team's work on the CIG project and the Kansas Water Office Tech Farms is developing a template that will increase water efficiency through simple economical best practices. WaterPack has also paid K-State to complete an economic analysis of the effects of irrigated agriculture and the value of water in the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer. Most of all, we have the people. TNC, Kansas Corn, GMD5, WaterPack, Lee Wheeler Engineering, Lee Schwab Attorneys, everybody's got to have a lawyer, and a committed community of producers that are all working together to ensure a future where everyone prospers, whether they farm or fly. So that concludes my presentation. I think Heidi and I will stand together for questions if you got them for both of us. I think Earl's still on the hit list.
Mr. Jansen, you did a great book report there. I appreciate that very much. From an overgrown fifth grader myself, I'll give you a B+ for the book report, but I'll give you an A for your cooperative working with your community there on what you're trying to do. You're doing a very good job. I think we've is Farron on? Farrell, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm here, Mr. Chair.
Would you like to go ahead and present a little bit to us?
Sure, if you have a little bit of time. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Sorry I could not be with you today. I have other meetings this afternoon that I just couldn't get away from. And bear with me, we got the tornado sirens going off in the background for the statewide tornado drill, so a little distracting. GMD5, we are very unique. We are doing our best to address several issues going on in central Kansas. Part of the reason we have several issues is we have that recharging aquifer that the other folks this morning have already talked about in depth, so I won't belabor that much more. We closed the district down to new water rights by and large in 1993. That is in response to what the science was telling us at the time, that the water tables were beginning to decline at a rate that we needed to slow down the production of new wells, slow down that new development in the area so that we wouldn't become an area that was not sustainable over a long-term period. The result of that choice of my predecessors and those boards was that our water table is very, very stable. Kansas Geological Survey, we provide data to them every month on the water table. And as the maps show, the water table doesn't change much. And in fact, Mr. Jansen showed some water level trends that indicate that we're very, very stable. Yes, we do have some decline areas. Yes, we do have some sustainability issues, but I believe they're very, very manageable. And so really what we're dealing with Quivira, in my opinion, based on my time spent on this, I started with the district in 2006, and this was my first project, was to address Quivira and to provide data to the manager at that time to deal with the issues. In my opinion, what the issue is not a water table depth issue as far as a decline, but rather an availability of water for the stream at any given time. And so the water table is stable, but it's lying just short of the bottom of that stream. So it's just below the base of that stream channel. And so the issue to address would be restoring the aquifer. That is why it's so much more difficult to address this through a LEMA, is the required water right reductions would be very, very great to restore the aquifer rather than stabilize. If we were to stabilize the aquifer, it'd be very manageable because we're very, very close to it already. We're already doing that without a local enhanced management area. And so if we're looking to restore the aquifer via water rights retirements, water right restrictions, the economic impact is potentially rather great. So that led us to the idea of developing an augmentation well field. So that's why in 2015, while the chief engineer was exploring whether or not there's an impairment at Quivira, we worked with our local folks to put in place, with the help of the legislature, thank you, to add the additional option to address an impairment for Quivira, the option of augmentation well field. And so we are right now about halfway through with fully assessing the feasibility, not just economically, but hydrologically, every other checkpoint that the federal law requires. We're going through that process with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Agriculture, both state and federal partners is really what I'm getting at, to fully assess what an impairment remedy would look like. And the big difference between what we're doing now and what we did in 2000 with the management program is that this is going to be fully funded. That is a key difference. In 2000, we came with several ideas, including augmentation, water right restrictions, end gun removal, tree removal, low head dams. Those were all in that 2000 management program. The issue was the programs were not available at the beginning. The funding was not available at the beginning. What we're doing now is we're developing the programs so that when the large project is ready to go, all of those will be available, fully developed and funded from day zero. So that when we get to the end of this, we will have the ability to tell our grandchildren, this is something that your grandfather put in place so that you have sustainable water table, you have a refuge you can go visit, enjoy bird watching, enjoy nature. It is a beautiful resource. If you ever get a chance to get out and visit it, I highly recommend it. We are working together to address this concern cooperatively and collectively for a holistic approach. So it's not just water right restrictions or buyouts. It's not just augmentation. We're still working on what that final solution looks like, but we're going to get there, and we stand committed to doing so. GMD5 has spent well over $4 million in the last 3 years to address this one issue. If that doesn't speak volumes to our level of commitment, I don't know what else does. So we stand committed to doing this and doing it correctly. And I'd be happy to address any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Farrell. At this time, committee, any questions for any of our presenters, actually? Representative Blex.
Thank you. This would be for Earl Lewis. And thank you for that pre-dinner time. It'd take a while to ruminate on your report, about 4 or 5 days, I think, but it was well delivered. And the 14,632 acre feet and 96 that was certified for Quivira, that you give that, and then if I'm understanding you right, then in an agreement with in 87, basically they also agreed to an 8,000. Now the certificate of 14,000 has not changed any. Has that, or has the service reneged on that 8,000 agreement, or just where are we at on that?
Yeah, first, so the certificate was issued in 1996. It has not changed. 14,632 has not changed since that time. When I talk about the negotiation or discussion with the service at the time, really it's to get to that point. Ultimately, it's, again, by the Appropriation Act, by the statute, the chief engineer makes that determination what that certificate is. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife can't come back and say, you know, we're going to renege on that and we want something else. They don't have the ability to do that either. Now, any water right holder, not just the service, could say, I want to reduce my water right myself, right? I want to give up some of my water right. They have the ability to do that, but they can't come back in and say, we didn't, that 8,000 number, we want half of it back. It's set. We don't go back up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One more. So if we can't get this voluntarily agreed on, and it has to go to a court situation, then we could open a whole can of worms for every water right holder in the state on the first in time right issue. Am I understanding that?
Potentially, right? I mean, so yeah, it's the purpose of the impairment and then the call for water is really, that's a regulatory process, right? But the regulatory process rests with Division of Water Resources and the chief engineer. So I think the court getting involved, really, the situation there could be if we don't do our statutory duty, right? Then I think we are open to litigation primarily by a senior water right holder. And again, this is just in anywhere, not just in this case. But if we don't do our duty as laid out in 706B, it says where we shall take action, then I think the court could step in. And I think that their options are much more limited to address the issue than ours are. We have a whole host. I think their options are much more strict first in time, first in right. And again, just to kind of give you a scope, as we've been participating in the environmental assessment that Orrin talked about, with hopefully leading to an augmentation project. And one of the things they have to look at is what if it doesn't happen, right? What if there's no action from the augmentation? The modeling would say that to do a strict first in time, first in right, we need to shut off on the order of 810 wells for no less than 2 years in order to get that water level to recover to a point where the stream flow is being supported to a level that the refuge's water right can be sustained. So that's kind of the scope. It's kind of a bookend, if you will. And certainly we want to avoid that if possible, but that kind of gives you a scope of where do we want to get a plan that avoids that.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Bloom.
Second. The junior wells, they're all used for food production, right?
Not all of them.
What are they used for?
Well, I mean, the majority are for irrigation, but I mean, there's certainly stock water, there's municipal, there's some other recreation. The majority are for irrigation, though.
But mainly it's for food production.
It's for irrigation for agriculture purposes.
And the World Food Supply is like 2 weeks. In your opinion, when does food trump recreation?
Under the law, never. It is first in time, first in right, regardless of use. And that really goes back to what is the state's role, right? These are private property rights. And so does the state have a role in picking that you should have, your property rights should be protected and Representative Stogdale should not, right? Should the state get involved in saying what you can do on your property versus what he can do? That's kind of the line in this case of saying it doesn't matter what the type of use is. It is first in time, first in right, regardless of what type of use, regardless of what type of economic activity it is, regardless of anything other than who got their water right first, who got it second. It's a very harsh system, but it's a system that's used across the western United States. And yes, there can be impacts on any number of things, regardless of whether it's food production or something else. That's
Thank you.
the way the law is.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, Earl. Good to see you again. I just have a short series of questions. So my first, I was wondering how many times has the USFWS filed a request to secure water? And then what's kind of like the actual follow-up to that? You say kind of like administration, but what does that mean in practical terms?
Yeah, so there's been 3 different times, 2017, 2018, and then of course this year as well. And so the follow-up to that in 2017 and 2018 first were to try and work with the groundwater major district local stakeholders to develop, recognizing that this is kind of a systemic problem that involves a number of different users to try and develop an area-wide solution through local enhanced management area. That's really was the effort in 2017 and 2018 that was unsuccessful. And then in 2019, there was leading to an administration that would have been somewhat proportional cuts based on the impact of the stream. And so I think there's a number of things that we have available that we'll be looking at to try and figure out what's the best path forward from where we are today till 2024. It can, again, vary from that very harsh, very strict 810 folks that are shut off for a couple of years to something that's hopefully less severe and again, tries to resolve the issue for the long term.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, you talked a little bit about the augmentation project and how you do have some fears that it may not ultimately address all 8,000 acre feet of impairment. So based on current studies, is there any estimate of the amount of impairment it would actually address? And then are there any conversations about how to, like, what is the actual follow-up to that? So if this isn't going to address the issue, what are we going to do if it's been 30 years, ALIMA has been tried, we're still studying the issue, you know, and we're getting these requests to actually administer the right. So what's the follow-up?
Well, I think it's kind of a two-part answer, and I think it's probably too early to tell on both of those. The first, as Warren has mentioned, they're kind of in the middle of that evaluation of the feasibility of the augmentation project. Again, I'm not saying that it won't provide 8,000 acre feet. I'm just, again, trying to make sure I'm putting everybody on notice of what I think will happen. It'll be somewhere in between. I don't know what it'll be. And again, we're going to have to balance that versus our other job of protecting existing uses that are in that well field that are supplying that augmentation water. So I don't know what that number is going to be. And likewise, I don't know what all the remedies are going to be that may fill in a gap. Certainly, you've heard from Heidi and Pat some of the voluntary efforts, and certainly those are going to be a big piece of that. We'll have to see how that plays out and how much of that gap that could be filled there. So it's going to be a combination of things, I think, that they'll lead to resolution here. I just don't know what all those are today.
And those efforts are to be done by 2024?
Well, that's certainly the hope, is that we'll have kind of the overall plan in place and have action in 24 and beyond.
Okay, thank you. And then I had one question for Heidi, if I may.
Let's let Representative Titus do one, and we'll come back to you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe these would be best answered by Mr. Farrell from GMD 5. I appreciate the effort of the GMD spending $4 million on this project. Can you explain how much of that was spent not related to the augmentation project, and give a general idea of what other programs you're developing in accordance with the Fish and Wildlife Plan?
Sure, give me just 1 second. I need to pull up a quick cheat sheet on my computer to answer that question accurately. Yes. So $4 million, where does that come from? Where am I coming up with that number? Approximately $2.5 million of that, 2.7 is probably the more accurate number, would be a combination of water rights that we have purchased, lands that we have purchased. One for the water right purchases. Those are water rights that we now own in conservancy. They will not be put back into operation by the district for irrigated agriculture. Those are in those red areas that, Mr. Lewis showed earlier in those response zones. They're right in the heart of that response zone area. So they have high impact if they were to be put back into service. The remaining 1.3 out of the 4 million is a combination of projects that we're working with Heidi Mell and the Nature Conservancy, the CIG project, as well as this watershed plan expenditures for our consultants, legal, always legal, and then some folks that we are having employment for or on contract for consulting with dealing with the whole NEPA process, because it is a tedious process if you've ever gone through it before. Also, consultants that are doing the hydrologic modeling, not just for the watershed plan, but also evaluating independent water rights that are being proposed to be transferred out of the Rattlesnake. We evaluate those using our model as well. We are in the current process of buying new equipment to better handle and understand the water quality changes in the area, because that's the big question, is impact of any kind of program in the area that would modify the water quality, that's just as devastating as water quantity. And so we're investing into that that equipment as well. Now, other programs beyond that, that would go beyond the $4 million scope, and we could definitely get into that if you'd like to go into that.
I'm trying to decide whether I want to. So based on your explanation, that you consider the watershed plan to be more than a study to whether augmentation is the sustainable solution or not?
Absolutely.
Can you explain how an alternative result might come out of that?
Sure. So my understanding of the process is that we laid out a problem, a need for the program. Then you lay out what your purpose is to address that need. So that's the purpose and need statement. That's the very first process that you have to work through in this program. Then you identify things that have been done to date. So of course, the Rattlesnake Creek Management Program, the failed Lima from 2018. Those programs are obviously laid out in the document. Then you lay out a series of alternatives that have been proposed before but never fully investigated, such as augmentation plus additional water right retirements, transfers of water, end gun removal, tree removal, strict administration of water rights. Let's see, I'm trying to think of others. Maybe reuse of water by Quivira to circulate that water back from the waters leaving Quivira, circulate that back to the south and reuse that water. All those are being evaluated in this watershed plan. So it's not just an evaluation on the feasibility of augmentation by itself. No, it's evaluating and laying every possible idea out there, having public involvement, not just from agencies, but also local stakeholders on their desire to see something happen. So if they have an idea, more than welcome to submit it. We'll take a good look at it, evaluate it against the matrix that's in the program, and then at the end of it, we'll work with NRCS to develop what will be the next implementation plan. That's the next phase. And I don't know, it's too early to speculate what that will be. If it'll be augmentation, plus something else, if it'll be requesting the chief engineer to institute an IGUCA. I don't know what that's going to look like, but those are all on the table being evaluated right now.
Thank you. That's helpful. One other thing that I think may be helpful for some of my colleagues, you mentioned retiring water rights, and that's often not a very efficient process. If you have it at your fingertips, could you share the acre feet and the cost of those acre feet, or just a rough idea so folks know that path can be difficult sometimes? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Currently, GMD5 owns approximately 440 acre feet in the Rattlesnake, an additional 105 acre feet in the Arkansas River Basin. We're the only GMD that owns water rights. For that amount of water right purchasing, it averages about $2,000 per acre foot. So you can kind of do the math. It's very, very pricey to do that. And understand, these are public funds. These are bids that we've accepted. They're going to be the low bid. So if these were going to open market bidding, my guess is it would be much, much higher than that. But those are the baseline numbers that we have been able to secure previously.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This one's for Heidi. Hi, thanks for being here today. Your presentation was excellent. I'm really interested in your Conservation Innovation Grant Program, and we've heard a little bit from other GMDs about the need for this across the state to kind of audit, so to speak, the existing irrigation systems and make recommendations for improving those systems, increasing efficiencies, reducing water use, and also connecting them with the resources in order to do that. So I was just wondering, is there any discussions about expanding this? What have been some of the major successes you've seen with the program and the broader applicability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has been our intention all along to at least export learning, even if we don't expand the geography of the program, because these grants are capped at a certain amount. And so we tried to be really thoughtful about the amount that we were requesting and where we could concentrate that to do the most good. So we did set the Rattlesnake Creek Basin as our geographic limit, but it is our intention to take our learnings from the grant and export them to other GMDs, other groundwater use areas. And you know, like the slide I put up, every aquifer formation is created differently. So the considerations are going to be different, the soil types are going to be different, but I think there are learnings that can be shared across different irrigation regions. So, what was the second part of your question?
That addressed it, just,
That was pretty much.
yeah, kind of the broader applicability. That's, yeah, it sounds like a great program. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It really has been. It's been a great partnership.
Any other questions? Representative Meyer, I believe you're out there on the internet. Any questions? Not hearing from her. I guess, Pat, I have a question. What's your average annual rainfall?
Our average annual rainfall out there is about 24 inches. Last year on our farm, I think we averaged 3.5 inches in season. Just to throw that out there.
Pretty severe drought.
Yes, sir.
What, on the acres that we're looking at, that within your group, how many of those acres are grain production and how many are growing forage for livestock?
I believe last year it was 100% grain production. I don't think we had any forage acres in the mix.
And as I drive through the region, I've driven on the south and the north side of Covera. There seems to be a lot of cattle on pasture there. There's cattle on center pivots that appear to be triticale or a crop similar to that. There's a lot of animal agriculture there in that area also, it seems like.
Yeah, there's in the...
Closer to Covera, maybe.
Yeah, in that, well, in the 6 counties in the district, with the majority of the majority of the cattle feeding and stocker operations are in Pawnee and Barton County. But I think our one-time capacity in the area for cattle feeding is somewhere around 305,000 head.
That's a lot of cattle.
Yes, sir.
My home community is over 500,000 and growing. Every feed yard out there. But it's partly due to our climate being dry enough that the cattle do better there. You have sufficient water. We all have a different situation across the western part of the state and on the aquifers out there, don't we?
And it changes township by township. I mean, I guess if I am going to have a common repeatable theme for all of you today is that every 5 miles you move, the scenario is different out there. And we can't treat all irrigated agriculture the same because it isn't.
Thank you very much. Seeing no further questions today, we are adjourned.